Have you ever tried to change a behavior, either your own or somebody else's, using positive reinforcement? And you found yourself wondering, well, what would actually be reinforcing? What could I give in this situation that would increase this behavior in the future? Is it going to be something like food? Is it attention? Is it some other event that you can use as a reinforcer? Because if you're not using an effective reinforcer, you're not really doing positive reinforcement. So how can you find out what a reinforcer actually is? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at today, because I'm Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is behavior modification. Let's go. All right, so today we're going to be talking about positive reinforcement, but specifically we're going to be talking about how to make positive reinforcement effective using reinforcer assessment. That is, how can you tell that the stimulus or event that you're going to use in positive reinforcement is actually reinforcing? So if you have any questions on positive reinforcement and what that might entail, highly recommend before watching this video, take an overview of what positive reinforcement is. So check out this video for what is positive versus negative reinforcement versus punishment, where we differentiate between positive reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. And then also in terms of what type of reinforcers you can use, highly recommend this video for the 5 classifications of reinforcers. And then finally, if you're implementing positive reinforcement, there are some techniques to make it very effective. So how to use positive reinforcement effectively. But what we're going to take a look at today is, if you have all that down, if you have all the techniques, you know what positive reinforcement is, one of the things that's key is choosing a reinforcer that is actually effective. Choosing a reward for an individual that will actually increase the behavior when they receive that reward. Because again, if your stimulus or event that you chose for positive reinforcement is not reinforcing, then you're not really doing positive reinforcement. So we got to make sure that that stimulus or event is actually a reinforcer. So what we're going to look at today is, how can we assess whether something is a reinforcer, and then how can we assess whether that thing is a very effective reinforcer or maybe not as effective as we thought, and under what conditions might it be effective. So this all goes back to B.F. Skinner and his assessment of reinforcers and testing reinforcers. So this is coming directly from the man from Science and Human Behavior, and this was in his chapter on operant behavior. And Skinner went on to elucidate that the only way to tell whether or not a given event is reinforcing is a direct test. So this quote, this only way to tell whether or not a given event is reinforcing to a given organism under given conditions, is to make a direct test. So this quote actually spanned 2 pages, which increased the level of difficulty of editing of this video. So I think I'm entitled to a... All right, so back to the issue at hand. So Skinner says that the only way to tell whether or not a given event is reinforcing to a given organism, so you can use it for positive reinforcement, under given conditions, is to make a direct test. So this given event, you have chosen a stimulus, you have chosen an event. This is what is going to be the consequence of a behavior, and it's positive reinforcement. So when you present that event, you want the behavior to go up. So whether or not that's actually going to happen, whether or not that event is actually reinforcing, we need to figure that out. And the only way to figure it out, according to Skinner, is to make a direct test. So we need direct data-based methods to determine whether a stimulus actually works as a reinforcer. And we direct test the stimulus by presenting it and then measuring changes in the response rate. And the reason that we need to do this is because oftentimes when we're trying to choose a reinforcer, we will do a preference assessment. And we will basically see, for a particular client, for example, whose behavior we're trying to change, what is their preferred stimuli? What are their highly preferred stimuli? What are their low preferred stimuli? And that's a good first step to determining whether something might be a reinforcer. So do you like Snickers more than you like chips? Do you like TV time more than you like playing in a playground, for example? So you can do these preference analyses, but as we're going to see today, highly preferred stimuli might not always function as reinforcers. Less preferred stimuli can function as reinforcers under certain conditions. So we need to test these directly in the conditions that we're going to be using the reinforcer. So what kind of direct tests have been developed to check this out? We're going to take a look at 4 of those, 4 types of reinforcer assessments. And we are going to start with number 1. And this is in the moment reinforcer analysis. So in the moment reinforcer analysis, it's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's exactly what's on the tin. This is where the person that's delivering the reinforcer, they deliver the reinforcer, and then immediately after they observe its effect. So you have a target behavior that you're trying to change, you deliver that reinforcer, and then immediately after you deliver that reinforcer, you take a look at its effect. And one example of this that might have happened to you in a sort of natural condition is, you can imagine this is like bringing food to a dinner party. So everybody was asked to bring a dish to the dinner party, and one person walks in and they're bringing themselves, or they're bringing a salad. Bring that salad. So they're bringing a salad. And one of the things that you do when you bring that food is you kind of take a look at the reactions of people. So are they excited, to see the salad? Are they, smiling at you? Are they reaching out for the salad and saying, oh, yeah, gimme, 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 gimme? That is all indicating that this salad might be an effective reinforcer. That would be an in-the-moment reinforcer analysis. On the other hand, you might be in a situation where you bring another dish to the party, and now you are taking a look at the response to this effect, and now this one is being completely ignored. Nobody's reaching for it, nobody's looking at it, nobody's smiling at it, which means that this bruschetta board would not make a good reinforcer according to in-the-moment reinforcer analysis. So what you do is you make this decision based on how the person that you present the reinforcer to, how do they react? What was their past interactions like previously with this stimulus? So previously when they were presented with salad, or previously when they were presented with bruschetta, how did they react? Performance data from previous trials where you gave them a salad, gave them bruschetta, and then also generalization to other similar items. So other similar types of food, other similar types of food presentations. How did they react to those in the past? You can make that decision based on any of those type of criteria or dimensions. So let's take a look at how effective in the moment reinforcer analysis can be. So there are some formal ways to assess stimulus preference. And what a study by Leaf et al. Found is that when you compare those formal paired stimulus preference assessments, these other ways of assessing whether a stimulus is going to be a good reinforcer or not a good reinforcer, but if you compare those very formal techniques to this in-the-moment reinforcer analysis, which seems to be very kind of a natural way to assess a reinforcer, what they found was that there was actually no difference in learning outcomes. So you could figure out a very effective reinforcer using paired stimulus preference analysis, or you can get a very effective reinforcer using in-the-moment reinforcer analysis. It didn't seem to change how effective the reinforcer was that you discovered. However, one good benefit for in-the-moment reinforcer analysis is that it's more efficient than formal preference assessments. These formal preference assessments, they take longer in order to determine which stimulus might be a good reinforcer, whereas in-the-moment reinforcer analysis can often very quickly get you to that effective reinforcer. All right, so that was reinforcer assessment technique number 1. So next we go to number 2. And number 2 is called concurrent schedule reinforcer assessments. And in this one, you get 2 or more reinforcement contingencies, and they operate simultaneously for different behaviors. So basically, you are pitting 2 reinforcers against each other to determine which one will be chosen more often, which one gets that higher response rate. So let's take a look at an example of this. It was a study by Rusco et al. And what they did is they compared high preference to low preference stimuli. So these were stimuli that were identified doing a preference assessment. And they were wondering, well, how effective are these at being reinforcers? So they compared high preference to low preference stimuli, and this was for adults with developmental disabilities. And what these adults had to do is they had to press one of two panels, and each panel was a different color. So for example, you would have a blue and a yellow panel. And if they pressed the blue panel, they would get their high preference reinforcer. If they pressed the yellow panel, they would get the low preference reinforcer. So let's see what happened in this study. So we're going to take a look at some of the data for only a specific subject. We're going to focus in here on Roger down here. So let's zoom in on Roger's data, and we'll enhance that, enhance, and then we'll enhance some more, enhance. So what we're going to do is, I got one last enhancement. There we go. So let's take a look at this piece by piece. We're going to break it down into each little section. So let's take a look at that first little section, the one that's labeled BL. So what we have here is we have the baseline phase. So on that x-axis, we have the number of sessions. So you can see that we spent 6 sessions in this baseline phase. And then on the y-axis, we have responses per minute. Basically, the higher the line, the more responses that were given per minute, the more panel presses occurred per minute. So for Roger, they did a preference assessment, and they found that his high preference stimulus, his high preference reinforcer was Snickers. He highly preferred Snickers bars. His low preference reinforcer was chips. So doing that preference analysis, they found that he preferred Snickers over chips. And then they tested, if you put Snickers as a reward for pressing the blue panel and you put chips as a reward for pressing the yellow panel, will there be a difference in how often he presses each panel? So let's start off with the baseline phase. And in the baseline phase, there was no reinforcement delivered. So this was basically how much would Roger press the panels when he wasn't receiving either a Snickers bar or a chip for pressing the panels. And as you can see, there's almost no responses whatsoever. There's very little responses per minute because there was no reinforcement being delivered. This is exactly what we would expect. But what happens in the treatment phase? What happens when now they put the Snickers bar behind the panel where the blue panel, and they put the chips behind the yellow panel? So now when you press the panels, you actually get the reward. Well, that is shown in this treatment phase. And in the treatment phase, what you can see is that we have a very different set of responses. Now, it's important to realize that this treatment phase here, this is a concurrent schedule, which means that both of these schedules are in operation at the same time. So the Snickers is there and the chips are there, the blue panel is there and the yellow panel is there. So Roger can decide which one he wants to press, but they're both available at the same time. And not surprisingly, we can see that Roger presses at a high rate when he is receiving the high preference stimuli, which is his Snickers bars, but he presses at a very low rate for the chips. Now, again, this is concurrently. So in each case, Roger is deciding, do I press the yellow or do I press the blue? And in this case, you can see that he more often presses the blue. He more often presses the panel that would get him that Snickers bar. So the high preference stimuli is a more effective reinforcer. And in fact, it looks like the chips is not working as a reinforcer at all. You can see that the chips level of pressing the panel is the same as baseline. So you might take a look at this and say, well, in this case, the data reveals that the Snickers are actually a reinforcer, right? We did that direct test. We saw that it raised that rate of responding. So the Snickers is a reinforcer, but the chips are not. The low preference stimuli, the chips, they actually don't function as a reinforcer. However, this is only because it's under a concurrent schedule of reinforcement. If you remove that high preference reinforcer, if you remove that high preference stimuli, basically you no longer give Roger access to Snickers. You go from a concurrent schedule of reinforcement to a single schedule of reinforcement. So here, press the blue panel, you get nothing. Press the yellow panel, you get chips. And as we can see in this case, when we go back to a baseline phase, basically when there are no chips available at all, the pressing of the blue panel really, really, really low. On the other hand, Pressing of the yellow panel was really, really, really low. Chips was on the yellow panel. So the pressing of the yellow panel goes back to baseline levels because there's nothing being rewarded. There's no reinforcement anymore. However, when that treatment phase begins again, when they now reward pressing the yellow panel with chips, pressing the yellow panel goes way up in responses, actually as high as it was when the Snickers was available. So this indicates that chips are an effective reinforcer when they're in isolation. So in the presence of Snickers bars, chips not reinforcing. However, on their own, chips very reinforcing. So this gives you that idea that you need to know under which conditions is a particular event going to be reinforcing. So chips alone, highly effective as a reinforcer. Chips with Snickers, not effective as a reinforcer. Number 3. So the third way to do a reinforcer assessment, this is multiple schedule reinforcer assessment. So this is also one where you have two contingencies. However, this time you have those two reinforcement schedules for the same behavior, but you only have one schedule in effect at a time. So you have a period where the first schedule is in effect, and then you have a period where that stops and the second schedule is in effect. You don't have two schedules at the same time. As the concurrent version of this, this is multiple schedule reinforcement assessment. So in this case, you have a discriminative stimulus that signals which schedule is active. So for example, we can take a look at whether social attention functions as a reinforcer. Let's say that we wanted to know whether social attention functions as a reinforcer for cooperative play. What we could do is we could use a discriminative stimulus to indicate which reinforcement schedule was in effect. So we could say, all right, we have children and we want to see if social attention is going to increase their cooperative play. So anytime that they play cooperatively, we're going to give them social attention. However, that schedule is only going to be in effect during the morning. So when it's morning, we are going to take a look at these children who are playing, and when they play cooperatively, we're going to give them social attention. So if they're playing cooperatively, we give them social attention. We say, hey, wow, that's very way to go. That's great playing together. You guys are so good. Give them that positive reinforcement through social attention. If you do that, the result might be that when the morning is present, during the morning time, when this reinforcement schedule is in effect, the social play will increase. There will be a high level of social play. However, what you do is you have a different schedule at night. So let's say that you're with these children all day and you have a different schedule at night. And at night, you give them a fixed time schedule that is a response independent schedule of social attention. So in this case, you still give them social attention. You don't want to ignore children, but now it's not contingent upon them playing cooperatively. Now it's just at fixed time intervals. And what you might find in that case is that the social attention, when it's given regardless of whether they're playing socially together or not, now all of a sudden in the afternoon session or that nighttime session, they're not playing together. There is no cooperative play. So if there is cooperative play when the reinforcement schedule is that positive reinforcement schedule of social attention for cooperative play, but there is less cooperative play when you're under a different schedule where social attention is not a consequence of cooperative play, that's a good indication that social attention is effective as a reinforcer for cooperative play. All right, and finally, number 4, reinforcer assessment technique. This is the progressive ratio schedule reinforcement assessment, and that is a mouthful. And this again is to see whether an event is a reinforcer under a certain condition. So this is another one of those conditional ones. And basically, this tests how much a stimulus remains reinforcer as the response requirements increase. So as the effort required, as the responses required increase in order to earn a reinforcer, does your reinforcer maintain its effectiveness or does it lose that effectiveness? So there was a study done by DeLeon et al. And what they did is they compared two similar stimuli, such as cookies versus crackers, and two dissimilar stimuli, such as drinks versus balloons. And they did concurrent schedule assessments of those. However, what they did is they progressively increased how many responses were needed in order to earn that reinforcer. So it was set up much like the Roscoe study, where if you press one panel, you receive one reinforcer. If you press another panel, you'll receive another reinforcer. So for example, you press blue, you get a cookie. You press yellow panel, you get a cracker. So we're going to take a look at the results here. And this time we're going to focus in on Elaine. So let's zoom in on Elaine and we'll enhance. And we have a bunch of different stages here of treatment. So let's go in on that first stage. So what we have there on the x-axis is, again, we have sessions. What we have there on the y-axis is the number of reinforcers earned. So for Elaine, she had 14 trials per session. So 14 trials where she could either press the button, the yellow panel, or she could press the blue panel. If she pressed the blue, she got a drink. If she pressed the yellow, she got a balloon in this case. So then she had that choice to make 14 times. And that's why these lines are always going to be symmetrical, because the total is always going to be 14. You choose more of one, you're going to get less of the other. So in this case, we can see that for the drink that was behind the blue panel, she pressed it around 7 to 8 times per session. So you got 14 trials in each session against 14 opportunities to earn that reinforcer. And she chose to earn the drink 7 to 8 times per session. And she chose to earn the balloon about 6 to 7 times per session. So very equal in terms of her preference for the balloon versus a drink. Very equal in terms of the reinforcing effectiveness of the balloon versus the drink. However, as we increase the effort that was required to get that reinforcer, I shouldn't have said however, and you'll see why in a second. As we increase the amount of responses that are required for that reinforcer, so basically now she has to press the panel twice in order to earn a reinforcer. What we can see is that now the drink is being chosen about 8-9 times per session, and the balloon is being chosen as a reinforcer, slightly less than that. However, still very close in terms of choosing the drink versus the balloon. And then as we increase the number of responses that are required, so now in the FR5 condition, it's a fixed ratio 5. She requires 5 responses, 5 presses in order to get that reinforcement. You can see that in this case, both the drink and the balloon are basically chosen at equal amounts. And then for fixed ratio 10 responses are required. Again, both the drink and the balloon are chosen at basically equal amounts. And then finally, in the fixed ratio 20 condition, when 20 responses are required, there's virtually no difference. Elaine chooses the drink 7 times. She chooses the balloon the other 7 times. So there was a pattern here that we saw throughout the number of responses required. When they required only 1 response to earn the reinforcer, these 2 reinforcers were pretty much equally effective. When she required 20 responses, they were still equally effective. However, that is not always the case. So let's take a look here now at 2 other reinforcers that they gave Elaine. This time we're going to take a look at chips and pretzels. So once again, we go to the fixed ratio 1 schedule, and you can see that chips and pretzels, dead even, right? 7 times chose to get the chip reward, 7 times chose to get the pretzel reward. What about on a fixed ratio of 2, when you had 2 responses required before you got that reinforcer? Well, again, very close. We have 6 to 7 times for the chips, 7 to 8 times for the pretzels. However, once the effort required, once the number of responses required started to increase past 2 responses, now we started to see a difference. So at the end of the sessions where 5 responses were required, now all of a sudden we can see that the chips are starting to be highly preferred compared to the pretzels. And then as we increase the number of responses required, that difference just gets more and more pronounced. So we can see that 2 reinforcers that seemed to start off as equally preferred, those differences as the schedules increased, as that amount of effort increased in terms of how much effort you need to put in to earn that reinforcer, the preferences then became magnified. Those differences, which were really small in the initial phases, now became magnified as we went to higher and higher ratios of responses required for that reinforcer. All right, so bottom line of this and the practical implications of this is that you need to understand reinforcement assessment methods to do effective reinforcing. So if you're going to change behavior, we need to know these reinforcement assessment methods because they allow us to choose the most effective reinforcers under specific conditions, and that improves our behavioral interventions. All right, so that is it for today. So today we took a look at reinforcer assessment and what it is. We took a look at the 4 types of reinforcer assessments: in the moment reinforcer analysis, concurrent schedule reinforcer assessment, multiple schedule reinforcement assessment, and then progressive ratio schedule reinforcement assessment. And then the practical implications of why we're doing this to make our reinforcers as effective as possible, because that makes our treatments as effective as possible. So next time, we're going to take a look at behavior chains and specifically the factors that affect the performance of behavior change. So if a complex sequence, you're trying to learn what are the factors of behavior hinder performance that will improve of. What I mean is, if you're trying to learn a complex sequence of behaviors, what are the factors that will improve or hinder performance? Now, that was a complex behavioral chain, and that is where we're going to end. So until next time, stay frosty, stay functional, and go modify some behavior. Have you ever wanted to change a behavior? Right out the gate. There's a lot of this is going to be a tough one.